All right, so we're ready for the next thing of the program. But before we do that, we'd like to thank the people or the companies that have contributed also with products and money to this event. To be honest, we just couldn't make it meet. You know, if, I mean, we couldn't make the budget meet if we didn't have these contributions from different companies. So we've got some people that have supported us through the years, but especially thank for this year to newcomer that came in very strong from its Belco from France. Give a big hand. So I've known this company since 2011, where we were organizing the World of Coffee in Nice. And they was the only one that seems to have woken up to anything in France at that time. So they were selling Harios, and they had some quite decent coffee. And I met a guy called Angel, who's sitting over there.
Hello?
Yeah, the one from the fertilizing company. And he could brew coffee. It was like, oh my God, I'm in France and I'm getting coffee. This is great. So. And since then, they've developed the company a lot. So they've, well, let me just say straight up, got rid of everything they call the traditionnel, which is all the sort of super commercial coffee is gone from the. That's really transformed the company a lot in these 4 years. Okay, so next one is Loring Smart Roast, and yeah, that's us. And thank you very much. And so, you know, speak to it's either Michael or me if you want to buy a roaster, right? Then it's Nordic approach, big support to the event as well for them, really great. And today you'll find Kaya, who is volunteering, if you want to speak about Nordic approach, or Joanne should be with us soon. Good. Contra Coffee, so we've got a lot of roasters that contribute just because they love the event. They've got no sort of, nothing to sell really, but big thanks to Contra Coffee, San Mateo, and another new that we are really happy to see as a sponsor this year is from Emmerich in Germany. It's Probat. Thank you very much. Sorry? It's Marcel from Probat. He's sitting in the back. So he works as a trainer mostly. So he's not the seller, but he's mostly an educator at Probat. So you can speak to him if you want to buy a roaster. Or learn something, yeah. And from Malkönig. Also, they're here, and it's Christian Klatt who represents them. He's got a lecture later today. I've got, of course, among the roasters that support us, Solberg and Hansen from Oslo. And I've also the cupping spoons. It's a long tradition. They sponsored it. It's W. Wright from UK. So they're silver coated, so very nice spoons, and they do that every year for us, so really nice for having this long relationship. It's Ben Brandt also, who is sponsoring for a lot of kitchen stuff and sievers and so on. And a big thank to Carlsberg as well for the beers, and Cafe Europa 1989, and very big supporter also, Vilfa, with all the machines for the speakers. And the pour-over, that is one for every participant, can take a little pour-over, where you can control the flow, close and open it.
It's by the entrance in the other.
It's by the entrance. You take it when you leave today. Okay, and of course, we've got Iikawa with Bradley. And Hario from Japan has sent some equipment that we can use. Of course, the Akaya roasters, they sponsored all the Akaya roasters. Scales, sorry. Oh, sorry. Just tired. higher scales. Yeah. And Stelton for the thermos, and Kier Sommerfeld for the wine. Okay, thanks very much for the sponsors. Thank you for everyone. So now we're doing the first speaker, Morten Munchow, who has been, well, I met him first time, what was it, 12 years ago, and he had this idea, this crazy idea to sort of educate people in a way so they can understand what you're trying to tell them. And since that, he's been a specialist at doing that. He took his master's in exactly that subject. How do you make difficult, accessible data available to people so they can actually understand what you're trying to say? Now he's been doing so much focus on the sensory, which I think is great, because we all try to have different theories about what we're doing, but really, can you taste it, you know? And this is what he's trying to put some systems in it. It's not as easy as it sounds. It's really difficult. So, and he's now going to tell us about the data that we collected yesterday, and among other things. Welcome to Morten Munchow.
Actually, my master's thesis was about bridging Tibetan Buddhism with Western cognitive science. So it was not exactly this, but it involved a lot of science. But I did do a project on teaching science, which led to all this. This presentation, I would say, is actually a culmination of a pretty long journey the last couple of years with different projects. And in order to really conclude all these kind of data, we still needed the magic bullet. And the question is, did we get it yesterday? And that's the last slide. So here you can see that this presentation is about sensory evaluation of coffee roasting. And we've been looking at this from, first very crude aspects where we talked about roasting defects, and then we've been moving to more and more subtle aspects of modulation. So that's the overall theme of everything here. And one of the great, the things that this really shows is how interesting it is to have sensory science as part of what we do, and particularly in coffee roasting. I think that this is just, all the data that I'll show you now prove that this is a really interesting combination. So the purpose of the research, there are different purposes. Of course, the most upfront is how to map what happens in the roasting process to the sensory properties that comes out in the other end. Because there's been a lot of community claims. Everybody has been trawling the internet for blogs and read all the articles in roast magazines and trying to kind of, if you're looking in the roasting literature, you get extremely advanced commodity coffee research, and then a lot of anecdotal stuff, books so there's, what's happening in between. That's really the gap that we in Coffee Mind try to fill out. So I've been training at London School of Coffee since 2007. More than 400 people in small groups of 6 I've had through that class. And so I've developed, as a trainer, I have a lot of answers. People ask me stuff and I answer. And most often I believe the answer myself. And sometimes, people travel along, a long way and they pay a lot, so you kind of had to come up with something. So you really do your best for all the questions, and over the years you develop a kind of a bank of things that you say, and sometimes you kind of forget to be critical. So this has happened to me over the years, which I'm actually happy because I know I helped a lot of people, even with my anecdotes. But having taken Ida 2 years ago into the company. Putting all the different roast profiles through her, method, but also just discussing, claims with somebody who's fresh out of university. You kind of have to rethink what you say, which is very healthy. So it's been so interesting, but also pretty challenging for me to have all my claims, validated, and that's a process that I'm going through. And at the moment, I'm kind of really often very anxious about, the future of coffee roasting training, because it's so difficult. Even things that we thought, this is solid, this is true. Body is of course modulated on different roast profiles. That's for sure. Some gets very watery, and some doesn't get watery, and we might be able to measure this with TDS. That's everybody are completely certain about this, right? I've got some interesting slides on that. So it's it's very healthy to be able to have to calibrate a panel that will taste things in triplicate and blinded, because if you don't get a signal or a result, it might be because you didn't calibrate them well. It might be that the phenomena exist, and it might not. But before you have the proof, you have to kind of rest in that unease for a while. So one of the things that we also thought about, could clean cup, the concept of clean cup from green, could that be used in roasting in some kind of meaningful way? And that was the subject of Tina's master's thesis that is now published in food chemistry. I'll just give you a small recap on that, because that was what I talked about at last Nordic Roaster. Also, I'm involved with, I'm the lead creator of the certification system of SCAE's roasting part. So here we also need to really make sure if we test people on something, we better test them on facts and not just my opinion or somebody else's opinion. Because it's not fair to put up a test with my claims, and if I go through these cups biased, I prove my own claims, but the student will, if they don't find it, is it because I'm wrong or because they fail to detect something that's there? So in order to build the certification system, we better have evidence for what we test for, whether that be the practical exams or the written exams. So that's one of the main things or concerns of this research, is to develop evidence for the certification system. But also in the certification system, you need to have standardized and well-defined differences between samples. This is a main concern in a certification system, because if you could take an exam where there are some samples you need to distinguish, let's say if the differences between the samples are not well defined, then there might be one training center where there are small differences between the sample, and there is another training center where there's a bigger difference between the sample. Which training center would you prefer to attend your exam at? Any ideas?
Big difference.
Bigger one.
Big differences. It improves the probability of you detecting the difference and therefore pass the exam. So this is a huge problem when designing the certification system, how to make sensible and well-defined differences between the samples that students are going to or will be confronted at the exam. So that's also something that's a concern in this research. So here are just these are the first roast parameters that we defined to put into the system: rate of rise, temperature differences, air and beam, development time, and stuff like that. Really classical concepts for coffee roasting. And the first research, we tried to go from the roasting defect into the sweet spot. So it was inspired by the 25-second. It was now it's perhaps more 30-second rule of espresso brewing. It's a rule of thumb that's extremely valuable for people with no coffee background. You will never win a barista championship if that's the only thing you know. But imagine how many cafes who would improve their quality a lot if that was the only thing they would, the only advice they got. Is really useful. And when I train people, I don't train coffee experts, I train beginners. So I'm looking for guidelines like this to make people, start on the right foot in the beginning, and then they can develop something advanced later. But I'm trying to find something that's really simple and useful for a lot of people that are new in coffee. And so the idea was to try to define the defect, so that at least as a trainer and consultant, the first thing you do is get people outside that area and into a sweet spot area. Okay? So I also showed you this yesterday. This was actually the research where we played around with, you know, extreme light, extreme dark, and then different timings in the different phases of the roasting process. And the result was also, as I showed you yesterday, that people could clearly distinguish between these samples, which wasn't a surprise. But also it was interesting that the reference or the normal or the baseline or what you would call it correlates well with complexity and other positive aroma attributes. So this is a kind of a support for the idea of a clean cup or sweet spot or something that is not a defect. And also the consumer panel. These were the food science professional panel. And these are consumers, and the consumers also associated the normal or, you know, baseline reference, what you prefer to call it, with, you know, harmonic, pleasant balance and other positive descriptors. So this was also a support for the idea that it makes sense to talk about a sweet spot in the light of the extremes that you could end up with. And also in the consumer study, you can see that the normal or reference was the one that was preferred. And this, we got it published 6 months ago, the aroma chemical analysis of these, because these were also analyzed chemically. And what we found, it's been a bit difficult for me to make a lot of sense of these, so I've asked Mikael Agerlin at Food Science, who is doing this. He's a specialist in aroma chemistry. And what he saw, he said, you know, the baked one seems like it correlates very well with a lot of pyracines found in bread crust. And he, in 2016, analyzed the aroma of bread crust. And he said that these were the ones they found in the bread crust, which is pretty interesting. Because the baked taste of a coffee is something that all coffee roasters really, you know, can detect. I think, that's my personal experience, that they can. So it seems to make sense that there are some molecules developed in the baked that is also found in bread crust. So that was just to explain you some of the background. Now we're going to the more subtle modulations. And this was actually the question posed last year. Rob Hoos was here. He talked about his flavor modulation, and that was his personal experience, not data. And somebody asked him about this, and yeah, obviously I talked with him, and we were really excited about doing something together. So he was here 2 months ago now to test his flavor modulation, because his book is a perfect set of hypotheses, valid hypotheses, that can be tested. So he's made a really nice systematic set of hypotheses, very well formulated. So it was a really good universe to kind of put into a research project. And here we are not concerned about the defect, but we are more comparing roast styles. So you've got roast style 1, 2, and 3, and the question is, what happens when you move between different roast styles? None of them are defects. So this is the same as, you know, dialing in an espresso to get the place where you think it peaks. And Alexander Pfuhl is the German roast champ from last year. We are working together he's really interested in research, so he's been part of the research together with Rob Hoos, and he was also part of the panel when 6 months, no, it's more, it was March last year. Alec Pfuhl came up, and we tried to do Rob Hoos's modulations, and then Ida had her professional panel evaluate it, and then we discussed the data with Rob. And then later, again, he's been over, and we've done it again. So we've had a few iterations of testing his flavor modulations. And this is Alexander Pfuhl's setup. So we distinguish between the development time, but also what Rob Hoos calls the Maillard time, the browning phase. And you can see we ended up with 6 different profiles. 3 with same Maillard and only variations in development time, and then 3 with same development time but modulation in the Maillard phase. And you can see here the color was Actron 90 plus minus 3. We hope to get plus minus 2, but we got plus minus 3. That's all right, I think. And these were the roast time, the overall roast time. So these were the input parameters in this sensory study. And what we found was, the overall question when you have 6 coffees that looks exactly the same visually, do they taste the same? So EDA's data here shows that they do not taste the same for acidity, bitterness, clean cup, roasted bread, cocoa, fruitiness, and aftertaste. But they do taste the same according to the panel when it comes to aroma intensity, body, balance, flavor, and sweetness. So the gray boxes, for the gray box, the attribute with the gray boxes, the level of this sensory attribute was not different from sample to sample. So it seems like the panel agreed that there is no modulation here. But there is a modulation on these. So the yellow one is a good indication. I don't know what this color is. Orange. There's a really, really strong, and for the red, there's an extremely strong modulation of this parameter between the. So this was overall. So let's look at only the development time. What made a difference in sensory attribute as a function of only changing the development time? It seemed like the overall aroma all of a sudden made a difference, and acidity, bitterness, clean cup, fruitiness, and roasted bread made a difference. The bread one is not a surprise because that's the baked. So here you can see that it's the baked one that really makes this different, because the development time, the baked one is defined in development time. But it seems like, clean cup, that was the, a meta descriptor. It's not a specific descriptor, but a meta descriptor. It actually seemed like the panel agreed that one of the cups were cleaner. And fruitiness, bitterness, acidity was also modulated. For the Maillard phase, you can see it's very different. Aftertaste and bitterness is strongly modulated here, where fruitiness and cocoa was not that strong, but also roasted bread actually changed. And this is according to Rapous's claim, you get a signal in body, but we are not sure if we have failed to calibrate the panel for body. If you don't get a signal or a result, there are 2 possible reasons. First one is there is no difference, and the second reason could be that the difference there was not found. That's the probability of what's called a type 2 error. And if you don't get a signal, it might be because you didn't find it or it's not there. And we don't know which is the case, but it seems like bitterness and aftertaste is modulated. Which is interesting because that, if you consider that close to the body attribute, it might support Rapous's claims, but it could also not. So it's still a bit open question, but I think it's interesting that we got these results on bitterness and aftertaste for the Maillard phase, because it's in the same area of sensory attributes. So sensory attributes for all samples. You remember this is the PCA plot is a plot that maps out visually the relationship between the input parameters and the output parameters, which is, input is the roast profile, output is the sensory properties. So here you can see the development time, that was the one with the shortest development time. In this study, the clean cup was actually very correlated with the shortest development time, but also acidity, balance, and fruitiness seem to correlate with D1. So it seems like the short development time, and I think this supports the more modern roast style where you actually speed up everything a lot, because you like cleanliness, acidity, balance, and fruitiness. That's something you like. So that supports the more modern way of roasting. But let's look at the clean cup for all samples, and we saw that there was a signal, but it doesn't seem that there's any systematic differences for all 6 samples. But if we look at only the development time, it seems like clean cup goes up when development times goes down. You can see 3, 2, 1 for development time. It seems like the clean cup goes up as the development times goes down for these samples. Fruitiness, there is an overall signal, but there's no systematic if you look at all 6. But if you only look at the development time modulation, it seems like the fruitiness goes up for a declining development time, or for a shorter development time. And this is also something, you know, I've said this for years, that if you have the same color and a shorter development time, you get more acidity and more fruitiness. But I wasn't sure. I hadn't seen the data. I was convinced myself. So it's just, I think it's really nice to have it like this, so that it's not just a claim, but it's actually a fact. And the same for acidity. Acidity goes up for declining development time. Yeah, and remember, this is the same color. It's the same color on a color meter. And then if you look at the bitterness for development time, you can see that it's reversed here. So for a longer development time, you get more bitterness on the same color. Okay, so it seems like you know, bitterness goes up and acidity goes down as the development time is shorter, even at the same or longer, even at the same color. It's very important that the color is not changing here, that you remember that. Okay, then we had Robus over. What I just showed you was Alexander Poole's data. But then we had Rob over, and we did it on the 1 kilo Propertino, the modulations, and we also did it on the Loring in here, all 5 rows. And here you can see the sample, some of them varied on the Maillard time, and some varied on the development time. Only small changes. And we are still chewing these data because we have a statistician, David, who is also in the project, and he is still, you know, challenging some of you know, the statistical calculations. So we are not completely done with this yet, but he allowed us to come up with this as indicative data. That it seems like in these data we did with Rob, it seemed like the longer the Maillard phase, so here you've got short Maillard, baseline, and long Maillard. The longer the Maillard phase, the more aftertaste you get. Same development time, same color. If you increase the Maillard phase, you get more aftertaste. And also more, actually this is not a linear relationship, but it is significantly different. That's why I've taken it as a slide, but I actually didn't yesterday. I didn't see that it, but the point is still that long Maillard gives you more bitterness. And also there's a signal on the roasted nutty chocolate that longer Maillard gives you more roastiness. Okay, so yesterday you did this. And these are the roast profiles that you tasted. And as you can see, it's 3 roast profiles that are very similar up until first crack. So the samples were the same color. You can see the fast was Actron 75, and baseline was 78, and bake was 76. And these are averages of 6 readings, so this is very reliable. And I would say that this is the same. It's plus minus 1.5 between the average. And one of the things I would like you to notice is that the fast one is actually, if one of these are the darkest, it's the fast. Okay? I designed these from the new certification system that I just submitted last Friday, where I've defined these samples as something that students should be tested at, and I tried to make it really specific how they should be made. So here you can see the fast one is 8 to 9 minutes to first crack, and as close on 1 minute as possible for development time. The reference is 9 minutes to first crack and 2 to 2.5 minute development time, and the baked needs to be really long. These are guidelines because it's from roaster to roaster. This is not necessarily possible to create them, but these are the guidelines for preparing the samples. And you can see the color is between 75 and 85, plus minus 3 actron per sample. So here it was 77, that was the average. And it was plus minus 1.5 rather than 3. So these were the samples that you tasted. And these data will support the new certification system in describing the differences. So what you found was that the reference was sweetest and cleanest of the three. Remember, I'm sure not all of you preferred the coffees yesterday, but that actually didn't really matter here. This was a technical cupping in the sense that the roast profile was technically defined so that they would be repeatable for trainers around the world. It was not the reference. I didn't spend time to really nail the reference as my personal favorite. I wanted to make great the reference so that I could create a fast and a baked that was different from the reference. So the point was, out of the three, the panel found the reference sweetest and cleanest, and nailed the baked, and also the fast one was the most fruity and most acidic. So the first thing you do when you done data is that you make a PCA, because then you can see if something, if there are some kind of clusters that things groups up in. But this is not a scientific proof for anything. You need to see if there's a significant difference between for the individual descriptors, and that's the next interesting question. So when Ida showed me this yesterday afternoon, we were extremely excited, because this is the first thing you see, and sometimes you just get all the attributes with gray boxes. That was actually the first thing that happened when we had Rapus over. And only when we started to stratify the data, we did find some significant differences. But this is for overall, so this is extremely good data. I think you should give yourself a hand. Hey. This is really amazing. So you can see acidity and fruitiness is really strong in modulation, and sweetness, bitterness, baked and clean cup is also modulated. What you can see here is all the individual assessors, and then the black bigger line is the panel average. And Ida got 50 valid data points, 50 valid, 50 persons submitted something that was useful, which is a really, really good percentage. So let's look at it. Acidity. Faster roast gives higher acidity, and the longer the development time, the lower acidity. Remember, this was, if any of these were dark, this was the one. Even though it was the same color, but this was Actron 76 or 75. So this is a very, very strong. Now we found this in several studies, we start to believe it. If it's found in one study, it could still be a coincidence, but now we've seen it in several studies. So this is now a fact that on the same color for shorter development time, you get more acidity. I tasted this for years, I've said it for years, but it's really nice to see it on a graph. And also for fruitiness. And the reversed for bitterness. And I just wanted to remind you that it seems like we found a similar relationship between roast degree and bitterness and acidity. This is a slide I've had, this was in the, it's a slide that was in the first ILI book. They've taken it out in the second one, I don't know why, but this is from the first ILI book. That the darker you roast, the more bitterness and lower acidity, which is a trivial, the reason why the acidity goes down is the organic acids, it's a decarboxylation process, it's called, so that you get less and less of some of the important acids. Some are built up, there's a lot of things happening, it's complex, it's coffee. But that's one of the reasons that acidity goes down, that the organic acids are broken down. And bitterness is a natural consequence of, I'm never able to say that word, the melanoidins, I think it's pronounced, the result of the Maillard reaction, the brown substances. So this is a known fact, and it's also known why it happens. But it's not really known yet why it happens for the same color for a longer development time, because it's a new fact. The baked one, you can see the baked one, it was only the baked that, where it seems like the reference and the fast are on the same level. For the baked one was clearly up. And clean cup was maximized in the reference, lower for the fast and lowest for the baked, which also makes sense. Sweetness, it's the first time we have a signal on sweetness in any of the studies, which is interesting because I've said for years that you maximize sweetness, in the middle. That the sweet spot of a roast profile also gives you the place where you get the high sweetness in the cup. But we haven't found that in any of the other studies. But it seemed like yesterday you found it. But also you also have to remember that these the samples can be made very differently on different coffees. So you will get a slightly different result every time you choose a different green or you use a different roaster. So that's why we are happy to see the same result on different roasters as well. Okay, and this is the spider plot of what you did yesterday. And you can see the red one are the strongly significant results, and the yellow ones are the significant results. And where there's no line is where we didn't get any signal at all. And I've added this slide to show you that it was small differences that you found. But because it was a big panel, we could find small differences with high certainty. And that's why we get good statistics. So that's one of the points also that some of you might remember we did this 2 years ago, where we had only 3 hours between data collection and the presentation. And 2 hours after the data collection, which was 1 hour before my presentation, Ida and I was sitting up there, oh my God, we don't have any data. It's in an hour. So it was pretty frustrating to have to kind of, it might be fun to go back and see the presentation actually. You can see how I work under stress. Then I start to talk a lot. And luckily I remembered Wender, the professor, he saved me because somebody asked me a critical question and he took over. And he can also talk a long time. So, but it was a bit, it wasn't great fun to have done all that and then didn't get a result. So, but because the point is when you do sensory data, the more assessors you have, the smaller differences you can find with high certainty. So that was the potential of making data with you, and that worked. And it's a huge, it might, I don't know how it felt like for you to participate yesterday, but Ida has been working for 2 years understanding it, because essentially the method you used yesterday is what they do at sensory science. And typically a project like that would take anything from 1 to 2 weeks with training and all that. But our assumption was, if it's coffee people, they're already pretty trained, so we can do this in short time if we have enough people. So Ida has spent a lot of time, what can we take so that we essentially do the same, but we've simplified it so much that it will work at an event like this. And she's done a lot of profilings and also worked with our professional panel for the 2 years. So the reason why it worked yesterday is that she's kind of refined the essence of the process so it can work in few hours with a big group of coffee experts, which is an amazing achievement. So I think we should also give Ida a hand for that work. So basically, these are the conclusions as far as I know. It makes sense to talk about a sweet spot from a consumer perspective, but also in a professional panel they were able to detect balance when talking about the reference roast. Clean cup from green can create meaningful data in expert panels. We found some marker molecules for some of the roasting defects. They are now published in food chemistry. And we have a clear mapping of acidity, bitterness, and fruitiness for development time. And we have integrative data for bitterness and in some experiment aftertaste for the Maillard time. And it's possible to create high-quality scientific valid data, sensory data at events. And we are really excited about this because if this is possible, we can make a lot of data. And we also hope that people think it's fun to be part of, because now you created these data. And body has proven a very difficult descriptor. Does anybody know why the Cup of Excellence has taken it out of their form? Well, it is. It might be because they face similar challenges. We have found it so interesting to work with body alone that we have described a master's thesis project for this question alone. What is body in coffee? How can we, the first step is to create samples that are for sure different. And you can, all the things, milk with different amount of fat, water with, a lot of minerals versus clean water, all that's great, it's good calibrations. But that's only the calibration. How would you create, now we are only concerned about, roasting profiles, because of course if you take a, Brazilian up against a Kenyan, but we need to do those data first. But how can you modulate body in the roasting process? We've failed to do it until now. Might be because we are not skilled roasters, might be because we haven't calibrated our panel, or it might be because it doesn't modulate. And we've dedicated, a master's thesis project only for this, because it's such an interesting question. And we might have found a candidate, which is Ida's personal assistant, but there's some negotiations still going on. So, but that's one of the learnings that we found in working with the panel and with these samples as well. That was it.
Thank you, Morten. That was interesting. I found it interesting. You found it interesting?
Yeah.
Finally something we can use. Not just theories. Are there any questions? Now is the good time to ask Morten questions. Yes, 1 second. Wait for the mic. Oh, sorry.
Thanks, Morten. I'm curious to know how much worse we were than a trained sensory scientific panel.
We got the data yesterday, so.
But they make significant difference.
Yeah, but that might be because there are a lot of people.
Yeah.
We don't know. Well, actually, Ida's PhD that starts on Monday is about understanding skill level. So at the moment we don't really have a baseline to compare skills up against, which is why we can't really answer the question. But I'm sure Ida would be able to. Perhaps Ida should answer the question. I don't know. Yeah, but because you can look in the data and actually each of your individual contributions is analyzable in the data that we got yesterday. I don't know, Ida, if you...
But yeah, I'm not sure I can answer that question either, because you have 50 people, and usually I only have 10 persons in the panel, and then I can look at each individual assessor and see how they perform. But with 50, it takes some time, but it's possible to look into each of your data and see how consistent you were. You tasted 3 samples and 3 replicates. So you had 10 copies of the table. I think the reference was in 4 replicates, and the 2 others was in 3. So what I can do is I can go in and see, did you score the same coffee at the same time, or 3 times?
And we can also detect if you cheat, which happens for number 57.
Yeah.
But so we actually have those data, but it's you know, when you have all these data, as Ida said yesterday, you have as interesting data about the samples as you do of each assessor. And what Ida did yesterday was analyzing the samples, because analyzing each assessor takes a lot of time. It's possible. So, but we haven't looked into that at all. But it's possible. But your question, the answer to your question, would we need to have a baseline of how skilled is the background population, how skilled is the average coffee person, and how skilled is somebody in a professional panel. And this is part of Ida's PhD, to get an idea of what is the skill level. But first you need to have a test battery designed that tests relevant skills. And that's part of the PhD, to have a test battery to map out skills. Do that on different types, on background population, average coffee person, and a professional panel. Because we need this in order to experiment with learning strategies, so that we need to measure the effect of the learning strategy. You can only do that if you have a time 0, a learning period, and then at time 1 where people have had training. So that's part of the PhD, to come up with a test battery that is relevant and with low variation, and then also get an idea of how are people in this from consumer to coffee person. So we don't know yet. In 3 years, we know.
Hi, Morten. Thanks for the great presentation.
Thank you.
I have just one question regarding one slide where you demonstrate from the Illy book. We go down with the acidity. Have you any research from, let's say, very lighter rows from the starting of the development time, just before the first crack? Because usually there is no acidity.
Yeah.
Like on the Greek market, for example, they really start in the development phase.
Yeah.
And then there's a certain point for different coffees where we really start to develop, that means we reduce the chlorogenic acid, and then we start to build up quinic acid and all the others. It would be interesting to have this correlation, even, let's say, to a, typical acid or citric acid or something like that.
But actually,
to see a certain point when you start to do that.
In the Gerhard.
Yeah, we have a little bit, but not in correlation with a real taste, let's say,
no,
taste
that's
result.
true. But that's
on the HPLC analyzer, it's easy to see, you start to develop something, but then even if it's really tasteable or not, at a certain point of the different coffees, that would be fantastic to know, because then you can easily calculate the development time and even how long time you have to reduce not too much acidity, let's say.
But also in different coffees, right? Because this depends a lot on...
Sure, when there is no coffee in the green, like Brazilian Santos or something like that, you cannot develop it.
But I think your question is a good example of, all the research in coffee is basically commodity, commodity questions. So, and your question comes from a specialty coffee point of view. And until now, nobody had the money to pursue those questions. So there's not the correlation, the sensory evaluation of subtle aspects of roast profiling. To my knowledge, it's not done yet. And that's
for
the
STAE, we have Mr. Yerisan now in our boat, I think, from Swiss University, and they have lots of possibilities.
Yes.
Hopefully they do it for the STAE.
Yeah.
It would be fantastic if we work together, and then even we can do something with the HPLC analyzer. That's no problem, but just the numbers, if I bore people just with a chemical reaction and all that stuff, but then if you have really a sensory result, completely on the same time, the same freshness, that would be fantastic. Because then we can say, okay, everything what you demonstrate today is more or less exactly what we can do in a chemical way.
Yeah. But
to describe it in different flavors, that they just pick up some of the very important ones from the 18 key compounds, maybe that would be fantastic.
Yeah. And that's to have the chemical data together with the sensory data is really valuable. To have the chemical data without the sensory data is pretty useless. Yeah. So the first step is to create some modulations in the roasting profile that are certain, and then measure if we get any sensory data on that. Because if we do not have the sensory data, it's not worth pursuing. So that's where we are now. We're doing everything we can to make modulations so that we get something on the sensory, and only then we are taking it further. So that's why I feel first we need to map the sensory, And then when we've done that, then we can ask, okay, because the chemical data can only explain the sensory. But if you have chemical data and you have no sensory, you don't know what is the magnitude, what is the relevance. So that's why the first step is creating something that changes in the sensory and then go to the chemical. So if we're doing this more, and we are, then we can start projects where the chemical analysis are made. We did that on the roasting defects because that was so extreme that we dared to start a chemical analysis of these samples already because they was extreme. But these are so small. There's no reason looking for chemical correlation to body in these samples because it doesn't change in the sensory. So we can't really see where is it present and when is it not.
Yeah. Hi, Morten.
Hi.
My name is Christopher. I'm another coffee roaster, so maybe this is another level about this question. I wonder about the color of the roast, or when you see this color, the same color. But if you look at the batch, for example, a batch of Kenyan coffee, you see if you look at the coffee, you see a lot of different sizes of coffee of the beans, and a lot of different colors of the roast. So how do you know which color is? And I think a small bean with a lighter color can be more developed than a bigger coffee bean.
Yeah. So the quick answer is that you grind it, because then you get the average. But you have to remember, what is varied and what is fixed here. So the coffee is the same in all, and only the roast profile changes. So you will get the same variation on all batches in this research project. So in research you always have the everything else the same concept, and then you decide what needs to change. So here, variation is not a problem in research. Bias is a problem, but not variation. If you have a lot of variation, you can just increase the amount of readings, and then you get a reliable average, even if you have big variation. So variation is never a problem in a research setup, as long as you can compensate with amount of tasters or amount of measurements. So I did 6 measurements on each color reading, exactly to compensate for any possible variation in what I did, or the samples I took from the coffee. I did 6 of those to make sure that my value represents the background roast that I'm trying to measure. So the short answer is variation is not a problem in a research setup, as long as you compensate for it. Bias is a problem.
So the variation is also the reason why we feel like we don't need to do the scales in the cupping, because they have so many readings, right?
Yeah, the scale.
Measuring the
exactly.
brew
Yes.
order, yeah.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah. If you have a lot of repetitions, your average becomes reliable.
Any other questions? We have time for more. Yes.
It's actually not really a question, but more like a comment on the quality of the data. With plotting it on the iPhone, I thought I was like only using like from 3 to 8 or something, and it wasn't really going from 1 to 15. And I just think that maybe others felt the same thing.
The whole screen.
Yeah. So just I think you can think about that when looking at the data.
Yeah, I think next time we will make the scale maybe only 10 points, so at least you would be able to see it on when you tip your phone.
Yeah, because there was probably a tendency for us, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I can see also on the data that you didn't use the whole scale. Even I would say for first time you were actually really good in using the scale. So, but yeah, it's a really good point. I had another person tell me that yesterday as well. So yeah, so thank you.
But I have a comment on that, because it's actually exactly the same, from a scientific or methodological point of view, it's not a problem. Because as long as you score consistently differences, then the statistics either uses, every judge used the scale differently. But you need to, the differences from each judge will be normalized into the same space, So it's just normalized all scores. So it's not a problem that people use it differently, as long as they score the acidic one consistently higher. If it's much higher or less higher, it doesn't matter. So the software compensates for people's individual ways of using the scale. And if the smartphone is one of the reasons why it's only, it actually doesn't matter. But it's true, we would get better data if we had 60 tablets. We didn't. So it's again one of the things that Ida has faced. You know, how can we make this happen without bias? Well, you know, it's a constraint. Yes, we should have had a tablet, all of us, like we do when Ida does it with her panels. They've got a big tablet, so everything is visible. Now that we don't have that, what can we do that still works? And your smartphones was the answer, and it proved that it worked. No bias, even though the variation might have been, but the average is still reliable.
Here, last question. Yes, thank you, Morten. What an amazing presentation and the work you do. I mean, and I think that might be something for the future, using these groups, these gatherings. I think the SCIE started using trade shows as gatherings and to collect data. Francisca a couple of years ago. And so if we get this data and get the modulations and actually get proof for all our myths and ideas and thoughts and pocket science, I think that's a wonderful way. And also you as a spokesperson or other scientists, like coming into the coffee industry or coming out of the coffee industry, I think that's the right way to communicate all these ideas. The manufacturers always have a bias or have to have a bias in the end. So my question would be, maybe, where's your funding coming from? Because we always, as a manufacturer, are of course asking ourselves, how can we get reliable data? Do we have to do it ourselves? Of course, we work with industry. I would say we work with universities, and then, but who is communicating results? Who is communicating also the funding? It needs to be transparent.
I hope that you noticed that the SCIE was on the first page, because I'm employed by SCIE at Food Science in Copenhagen to carry out this research. It's just a part-time position because most of my time is spent in Coffee Mind, but we also happen to do research. So it's a proposal between Coffee Mind and SCIE that generates research for the community. But since we're doing a lot of research, the idea is that everything we do will just get funneled through the SCIE's channel, which is extremely affordable compared to what it would take if you should fund it, without, just like that. Because research is extremely expensive. But that's the great, way we do it at Food Science, is that master's thesis students, they want a relevant project that goes into some industry. So for them, it's amazing to get to get the opportunity to have Ida and I as co-supervisors and providing all the coffee. They can roast the coffee at our place. We've got all the equipment. So it's a kind of, for them, it seems like a kind of scholarship or something like that. It's extra resources available to them if they choose this subject. And what we get is relevant research. So that's the funding. It's funded actually like that. So it's only our time as co-supervisors that needs to be paid. I'm not done yet.
Thank you. Thank you, Morten. So a big hand to Morten for his work, and Ida as well, of course. And we've been so good with timing like never before. And we are just lagging behind now, so we need to go to have the Columbia cupping, and I trust you will be really quick getting there and start the cupping. Thank you very much.